regulations became really complex. This includes a lot of compliance, burden. You have to monitor all changes. You have to measure your challenges. How can you really identify this, identify that? These trade wars are something to look out for.
But it's nothing new with sanctions and circumvention and evasion. I mean, we saw it a lot with Iran, also with North Korea. Russia is using a lot of the Iranian playbook. I mean, they've been good at it for some time, especially with hiding ownership and control. But now with using third countries to get goods into their own country, I think they're really using a lot of the Iranian playbook. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Louie Vargas from NFCP, and we're joined here by Denitsa Rebaine. Did I pronounce that correct?
Yeah, that was very nice.
I was like, let me do it slow, because just in case, but I'm glad I did it correctly. So yeah, we're honored that Denitsa is joining us today on this catch-up. She has agreed to join us for periodic sanctions kind of catch-ups. As you are aware from a previous video that Marco and I published, that we're going to be working with other industry experts on different topics. So this is our first iteration of that. So yeah, we're super happy to have Denitsa join us on this kind of NFCP FinCrime agent combo, video. We got to come up. I got to talk to Marco. We got to come up with a catchy name or something for these reviews. But anyway, so before I give it over the mic to Denitsa to introduce herself, I just want to provide some kind of housekeeping notes for everyone. Whatever we discuss here is our own personal views. We're not providing legal advice. Obviously, we've worked in the field for some time. We're going to provide some insights on regulatory updates and stuff like that, and give maybe some tips on how to address certain issues. But again, in your institution, check in with your managers, check in with your legal department. This is just to share our views and have some fun. Okay, so without further ado, you already know who I am. So please, Denitsa, introduce yourself to our audience. I'm sure a lot of people will already know of you. But just in case for those that don't, let us know a little bit about you.
Thank you, Louis. First of all, thank you for inviting me as a guest speaker to this format. I am familiar with both organizations. You see yourself and Marco. As you said, brief introduction about myself. I'm in financial crime compliance for now around 10 years. I started in AML, but most recently deal with sanctions, and by most recently I mean since 2019. So that's
Wow.
a bit longer. Now, so I should probably change that narrative for myself. So I am also the voice behind Compliance Time podcast, where we have met with you and Marco as well. So pleasure to be here and excited to talk about the most recent sanctions updates.
Awesome. Yeah. We're, like I said before, just to say it again, we're super excited to have you, and I look forward to the future kind of iterations of this kind of venue we have together, because we'll be trying to check in quarterly. So just for our audience to know, we'll be doing this quarterly with Denitsa. Sanctions events are very dynamic and change quite quickly. So we won't be doing a video, unfortunately, for each event, but we'll kind of try to do a catch up during our next forthcoming videos. So let's get into it. Denitsa, just to kind of kick things off, how would you describe the current state of affairs in the sanctions world, the sanctions landscape? Obviously there's different regimes and stuff like that, but let's kind of stick to the major ones, which for those of you who are not familiar, what we call in the industry, the major regimes are also depends where you're domiciled, but in the instance, we're both sitting in the EU. So we'll say EU first, right? And then we have the UK program, the US program, and the UN program. That's kind of the order as it stands where we sit today. But again, those priorities could change where our audience sits. But yeah, if you could give us kind of a description on that landscape, Denitsa.
So I think in order to understand better today, we need to go back a little bit in time, and I'll try in one sentence to return us a couple of years back when, sanctions were much easier than they are today, and I'll explain why. Before Russia, before the even 2014 events of Crimea, sanctions were usually imposed against nation or state actors where you had the acid freeze requirements, right? That this came out also through the UN, through also OFAC and the other jurisdictions you mentioned. So since 2014, the types of sanctions and the measures that governments are taking are much different. So, for example, we saw with Russia the sectoral sanctions. They first targeted, couple of financial sectors or oil, energy, military. Then, with the newest crisis in 2022, the key word then that everyone was mentioning was unprecedented sanctions. So on top of sanctioning a large amount of individuals and entities becoming subject to acid freezes, we started seeing measures such as, prohibiting certain transactions or not dealing with that industry. We did it with this industry, transit of goods, a lot of export controls tied into the core sanctions regimes, because export controls traditionally are sort of separate but tied to sanctions. Now they're much more ingrained into the whole sanctions program. So overall, regulations became really complex, and this includes a lot of compliance, burden. You have to monitor all changes. You have to measure your challenges. How can you really identify this, identify that? And most recently, if we focus on the most recent updates, what the EU, the UK, and to a certain extent OFAC are tackling is sanctions evasion. Mm-hmm. This is something now that sits not entirely again with sanctions, but very, very close to home, because you must ensure that appearing as legitimate actors are not acting in a malicious way, so trying to deliberately evade the imposed sanctions and provide benefits, goods, resources to Russia, or the main focus nowadays for that is on Russia, I would say. So this comes in with, most recently we saw listing of shadow fleets. Mm-hmm. So the governments are identifying ships that are doing activities such as, transfers of goods at sea, or belong somehow to the Russian shadow fleet. Mm-hmm. And last but not least, what everyone is discussing today mostly is divergence between the bodies. So it began with, the different regimes designated at different times sanctions targets. Like we can take, for example, the Russian oligarch Potanin, who was first designated by the UK, only later on became a sanctions target by UFAC. And I'm not sure if he's now EU target or not, because I lost track of all the oligarchs. In addition to, if we forget a bit about Russia, the divergence we can see most recently is also with Syria. With Assad being gone, we can see that the EU and UK started relaxing certain measures on their Syrian sanctions programs, while we still see a little bit hesitance from that in OFAC. So this puts a little bit in conflict European operators who maybe want to do business with legitimate business with Syria.
Only a quick pause here on the video to let you know that if you're passionate about financial crime prevention and want to advance your career, you must check out my FinCrime Career Accelerator course. It's designed to give you the skills and knowledge to thrive in this exciting field. So find the link in the video description right below, and we are back to the video now.
So that's my update on that question.
Yeah.
Feel free to add something.
Yeah, no, very good summary there. I guess the bits I would add is that you highlighted the divergence, and those I feel like are becoming more evident recently as the Trump administration has, taken over the U.S. Previous to that, the Biden administration, also due to the 2022 events of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's been more kind of synergies between the different regimes, more so US and UK, but the EU has also kind of followed suit. But now with the Trump administration kind of having this model of America first, you're starting to see now more divergence here. I mean, also to highlight one of the largest divergences, how the US sanctions Iran and the EU doesn't. And what we're going to see now is that the U.S. is promising enhanced sanctions on Iran and enhanced sanctions also on Venezuela. So I think that's going to be interesting to see in the coming months how, as you said, the different operators on the world kind of juggle those divergent activities. I guess I was just going to add another point to kind of what you described on the sanctions landscape. I agree with you 100% that now export controls and trade compliance now is being kind of blended with sanctions compliance. And I think that's a bit of an issue because we need to be upskilled. A lot of the compliance officers that have been in sanctions for some time don't have the background in export controls and trade compliance. That's actually a specialty that you could go to university for, right? So it's not like something you could pick up right away. But because of the way sanctions now are evolving, we kind of have to be on the fly and understand these risks and how to adjust to it a bit quicker, especially, as you said, with sanctions, evasion and circumvention. But it's nothing new with sanctions and circumvention and evasion. I mean, we saw it a lot with Iran, also with North Korea. Russia is using a lot of the Iranian playbook. So, it makes sense that, I mean, they've been good at it for some time, especially with hiding ownership and control. But now with using third countries to get goods into their own country, I think they're really using a lot of the Iranian playbook. So yeah, we'll see how that continues to evolve. And you had mentioned, your previous experience in the AML world, and I feel like now sanctions, we're starting to hear a lot of reports where sanctions is starting to now tap in to a lot of what the AML world is using to kind of find out about these evasion attempts or circumvention attempts, because they will try to use transaction monitoring scenarios to then pick up on, how these flows are changing and moving, and might pick up on typologies that are already known, but potentially pick up on new typologies. I'm just curious from your side, have you seen any more movement on that, where you're hearing that banks are kind of going to a bit of a hybrid model between sanctions and TM?
Yeah, I have heard around some industry events that a lot of financial institutions have dedicated resources, like sort of special investigations team that blends sanctions and AML. Before it was more, AML specialized units that are focusing on these new typologies, but I think it is a trend where you can actually combine both and tackle these kind of issues, which are not necessarily captured by your screening filters just because nobody's really yet designated. And to your point about export controls, those are, matters in trade finance that it's really important to understand the types of goods, how it can be used, which I totally agree. If we need to focus more on that, we certainly need an upskill from, industry recognized bodies that provide such either certifications, training, education.
Yeah, exactly. I'm lucky at my team that I actually work with two people who are quite, know export controls quite well. One who was actually in industry before moving into the financial sector, and one that was in the government before moving into the private sector. But, I think that, a lot of banks are going to realize they can't just rely on one or two people to get it right. So, as you said, training will be key there. So we'll see how that evolves and how sanctions compliance officers' skill set, their toolbox kind of expands in the near future.
Mm.
Cool. We started touching upon divergence, and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on, how do you see divergence complicating global compliance efforts?
Yeah, well, the first one, the most obvious, I guess, is the regional conflicts, right?
Mhm.
When the laws start conflicting each other. Oh, that's permissible per OFAC, but wait, we have a blocking statute on that, and for example, China may actively seek bypassing U.S. sanctions because they are, really trying to limit a lot of now the investment side in China, or the European companies may be caught in between the U.S. and the EU, where a divergence, if it happens with Russia, could affect a relationship and ties with the East.
Mhm.
The other threat, obviously, is from across the pond, where the United States has the ability to impose secondary sanctions. So, in cases of divergence, they can, target certain actors and impose restrictions on them for avoiding US sanctions. And last but not least, this all leads to an increased compliance costs. I mean, you have to, and probably significant business impact when you think of it from the business perspective, because companies must implement multiple strategies to adhere to the sanctions from each body, which can lead to higher resource allocation, right? Um, what I missed on the US side and what we saw recently is that it's not unexpected now if the other government's foreign policy is not aligning with the US one, for them to impose additional sanctions. We saw it recently with the ICC judge who in the Netherlands who was sanctioned by the states. So that's another thing that we have to be on the lookout for, I guess.
Exactly. Good points there. And yeah, I think I guess the greatest complexity that I see is like the non-blocking statute from the EU, right? So it's kind of giving EU operators the free pass not to follow US slash OFAC sanctions, but because of the extraterritorial approach that the US takes, it's really difficult for other operators to just rely on that kind of blanket. The EU is trying to provide kind of like a blanket approach to it, where you could say, "Don't worry about that; just worry about us," because the world, especially nowadays with technology, we're really a global. There's really a global infrastructure there, so it's not like you say, "Well, we could parse that out because we're only dealing with a certain jurisdiction." So it's
Where
nice
are
that
your
the EU
servers?
offers. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's another issue, right? The data protection and yeah, I remember when I first moved to the Nordics and we were trying to get a tool, and it Schrems 2 was around, and they're like, well, you can't get that tool because the servers are on the US, and it's like, oh man, how are we going to get around this? How are we going to make this right? I think now they've come to a new agreement, thank God. If anybody out there doesn't agree, please reach out and correct me. But I think a new agreement is made between EU and the US, so I think it's a bit more relaxed again. But yeah, with everything changing, especially with the current administrations we have across the world, it might change again. Who knows? But yeah, it's going to be a super interesting next couple of months for not just sanctions, but I think everything that's going on in the world and how we kind of share information with each other. So stay tuned for that. Moving forward with the next question for you, and I guess alluding to stuff I've said in the past, with the Trump administration and the idea that they will look to relax sanctions on Russia. What do you see the legal and political implications of that? With the U.S. kind of now diverging from the rest of the world.
Again, certainly not a lawyer here.
Yeah.
But those shifts in global dynamics can have very negative consequences on the measures that the EU and the UK, if the US relaxes their sanctions on Russia, I believe the EU and the UK, based on the indications that they have given, would not follow, not at least immediately, not until there is some kind of a progress that they expect to see politically in relation to Ukraine. So with that shift in dynamics, and the EU and the UK becoming the primary regimes against Russia, I think doing business with Russia becomes much more attractive to other nations or businesses, because they won't be as hesitant that they'll be penalized by the US, right? So we know that India and China are sort of supporting that, but once the executive order on secondary sanctions 14.0, you'll help me later with the numbers. Once that was published, a lot of Chinese business with Russia ceased due to fear of secondary sanctions, right? So I think although the EU-Russia regime, we can now comfortably say, is extraterritorial and does not apply within the EU only, still it's in its early stages, and it has not reached that maturity of being able to apply secondary sanctions the same way the OFAC regime can do. And obviously, I think that there can be some political reactions or pushback. We don't know how administrations would act in this event, including the EU, UK, and the US. So a bit hard to predict, but very interesting times, certainly, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and I guess also, as when this video is being recorded, yesterday there were reports that a limited ceasefire has been kind of agreed to between Ukraine and Russia, but not much details are available as to what was agreed. So stay tuned. Maybe our next update will cover details on the ceasefire and what the U.S. has agreed to do to accommodate Russia to agree to a ceasefire. So more to come on that.
I also noticed interesting from just last month when it was the anniversary, the third anniversary. I really don't like that word for that purposes, but I'll use it now. It was the third anniversary of the invasion, right? And what happened is the EU and the UK issued certain packages or designated additional people, especially EU is doing that traditionally from the beginning. But OFAC did not. For the first time on the 24th of February, OFAC did not issue any additional sanctions against Russia or listed anybody new.
Yeah, well, that's already a change in posture. So let's see what it looks like when we reconvene. Well, one last question for you. I know you've been on the hot seat, so thank you again for being with us. But I guess I want to pivot now to the potential issue with China. With the constant threat of China potentially invading Taiwan, similarly to how Russia invaded Ukraine. How do you anticipate the EU sanctions policy kind of being tailored to accommodate this geopolitical tension?
I think the EU has been much more relaxed towards China. Their restrictions and measures that were adopted to date were not as extensive as the ones done by the US.
Right.
However, most recently, what the US side did is introduced as outbound investment rule. It began, it's now in effect since January this year, which limits the US investments into certain sectors, including quantum computing, and artificial intelligence into China. What we can see the EU is doing, they're preparing now a white paper, and they published a white paper for very similar, not very similar, the same industries, and it requests, member states for their evaluations on the similar type of rules, investments into China. So it is possible that they're looking to prepare similar measures, maybe towards next year. I don't expect the EU having anything significant this year. But in general, China is a major player, and China has the real leverage and can respond as they have their own domestic sanctions and export controls. Now, most recently, I saw in the news that they adopted new laws where they can sanction in effect foreign companies operating there, or limit their access to goods and services. So I think these trade wars are really something to look out for, and we shouldn't forget to keep an eye on China and their developments and how the West is treating them in terms of sanctions.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Yeah, I have nothing to add there. I think you covered it quite well. And it's true. It's kind of hope it doesn't get to that stage, but we all didn't think Putin would invade Ukraine, and he did. So to me, it makes sense that we're just making sure we have a process in place just in case China does go forward with their supposed plans. So as we wrap things up here on our first kind of inaugural, talk on sanctions, do you have any kind of parting thoughts you want to share with our audience? Any tips
Happy
or tricks?
to look in the comments how people found the session, and if there are any kind of more in-depth knowledge that we should prepare for next time. I that's my only final thoughts. I'll be following the comment section to see what everyone is thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a great point, and thank you for mentioning that. If anybody, watching this video have any comments, have any questions, feel free to, like you said, put it in the comment section or reach out to myself, Denitsa, or Marco, and we will make sure to include that in the next update. We will try to also give a summary of the landscape since this last recording to the updated one next quarter. But we will also love your questions, because then we could kind of deep dive into those as well. And it might be a bit more interesting, maybe not so much interactive, because this is a recording, but at least it'll be interactive in a way that we could address some of the questions being raised to us and what our community feels is interesting. Cool.
Thank you again for your invite, and as you mentioned, for everyone watching or listening to this, feel free to connect on LinkedIn with us.
Yes, and also as Denitsa mentioned early on, she's the voice behind the Compliance Time. So please, if you're not following her podcast or her at the moment, please do so. And if, like I said, you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're here for you. Again, this is all for the community. So with that note, thanks again for our guest, Denitsa, for joining us. Have a great day wherever you are, and looking forward to talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.